Hello everyone, and welcome to this event. This is the first in a new series from the Natural Capital Initiative, the NCI, which is a partnership between three organisations, the Royal Society of Biology, the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and the James Hutton Institute. The NCI's mission is to support the decision-making that results in the sustainable management of our natural capital. My name's Kieran Woof, and I'm one of the science policy team at the Royal Society of Ecology. Our event today is on the topic of biodiversity, specifically the principle of biodiversity net gain and the policies that are being implemented to facilitate this. As many of you, I'm sure, are aware, the UK is one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world and follows the global trend of significant biodiversity loss. Therefore, it's crucial that we have the appropriate policies and expertise in place. I know it's a key concern for the three partnership organisations of the NCI. And so, yeah, we're really excited to hear from the two speakers we have today, and hopefully we can have a good discussion about it in the Q&A. On that note, we ask you to send your questions through the Q&A box. We'll then put them to the speakers after both of them have finished their talks. You can also tweet about this event using the hashtag Natural Capital Initiative. On that note, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Amy Wright, who is a principal ecologist at Native Ecology. Amy Wright is head of ecology at Native Ecology, with over 13 years experience in the professional ecological consultancy. She's a chartered member of CIEEM and has a wide expertise in ecological consultancy work, including biodiversity net gain, ecological impact assessment, preliminary appraisal and project management, as well as licensed experience of carrying out surveys for bats, great crested newts, riparian mammals, and other protected species. So, Amy, take it away when you're ready, please.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me here today to talk about biodiversity net gain. It's something that, as ecologists, we've been talking about for a number of years now. Specifically, I suppose, for Native Ecology, maybe the last 4 or 5 years, it's been something that has been on its way in, and we obviously don't have too long to wait now until it's a mandatory feature of what we do in our everyday jobs. So as ecological consultants, we work with developers, landowners, sometimes charities, usually on planning application projects, so maybe housing developments. And as I said, we've been working the last few years with our clients undertaking biodiversity net gain assessments, working out how it's going to come into force, how it's going to be used, and trying to move forward with our clients. So I will just share my screen. Hopefully this works. So biodiversity net gain, what is it? It is crucially the development that leaves biodiversity in a measurably better state than it was before the development took place. It doesn't make any difference to existing species or sites protection. So where we do surveys for bats, reptiles, great crested newts, those protected species, biodiversity net gain doesn't put any additional protection on those species, and nor does it take away any protection from those species. It is an assessment that we work alongside our assessments that we do already for planning applications. So your preliminary ecological appraisal, like I said, protected species surveys and ecological impact assessments, they're all still required. It doesn't change any of the planning application or planning policy requirements for those kind of assessments to take place. The current position with biodiversity net gain, as I said, we've been working with it as consultant ecologists probably for 4 or 5 years now, but it's been a very slow process, I suppose, from our point of view, and one that was knocked back by COVID a few years. So we have been waiting a while for it to come into force. It was mandated through the Environment Bill 2 years ago. There was a 2-year lead-in time. So that's where we've been for the past 2 years, working up to biodiversity net gain, getting ready for it. And now we're expecting it to become mandatory in November We don't have a date in November yet, and lots of our clients are phoning up saying, when is it going to be? What date is it going to be? But we don't actually know that yet. We just know that it will be in November. So when it becomes mandatory, it will apply to every single development application to local planning authorities, bar a few exceptions. All of our developer clients, anyone who's putting in a planning application, will have to do a biodiversity net gain assessment alongside their application. In April 2024, this is when a small sites metric and biodiversity net gain will be implemented. So the idea is that if BNG became mandatory for every single application, including all the thousands of small sites applications all at once, there might be too much of an avalanche. So the government are saving the small sites metric till April 2024. The devil is going to be in the detail, and we are expecting this secondary legislation soon. And in that legislation is going to be all the details about when, all the ins and outs about how biodiversity net gain is going to move through the planning system, who will be involved, the expectations of all the different industries that we will be working on this. So whilst we do know a lot about what biodiversity net gain will entail, is this secondary legislation that we are waiting for, which hasn't got long to come through yet, because we're still saying it's going to be November 2023 when it becomes mandatory for every application. A bit of an overview about biodiversity net gain. So it will be a minimum of a 10% requirement for every single planning application project. So each project will have to show that not only does it replace the biodiversity value of the site 100%, but then there's like a 10% additional gain on top of that. Any habitat that's secured by biodiversity net gain will have to be secured for at least 30 years. So there's a real long-term commitment for biodiversity management, maintenance associated with a biodiversity net gain assessment. The net gain can be delivered on-site or off-site, so it can be within the red line boundary of the development, or it could be off-site on another parcel of land, either owned by the same developer or owned by a third party. And then if it's not on-site, off or off-site, developers can purchase biodiversity units either from a habitat bank or the government statutory credits scheme. So those are kind of like a safety net. There is a kind of hierarchy there. So on-site is preferred, and if you can't get your 10% net gain or any of that 10% net gain on-site, then the second preference is off-site but adjacent, off-site further away, and the last resort is these statutory credit scheme. There are a number of industries kind of springing up as habitat banks. Some have been around for a while, but this is going to be something we're going to be seeing more and more of. Habitat banks are companies that they could be companies or charities that are purchasing land or own land. They create their own habitat enhancement on that land, and then they bank the biodiversity units that are created and sell those biodiversity units to anyone who needs them, usually developers, housing developers who have gone through the local planning system and can't get their biodiversity units on site or purchase any from landowners that they know. They'll go to these habitat banks to buy units. These units will be registered. We're waiting for more details on the register, but there'll be a national register of all the sites, what biodiversity units they are offering, how much they are, what kind of habitats they're offering. It's all going to be in a site register. There are some exemptions, not many though, to projects that need to show 10% biodiversity net gain. One is householder applications. So if it's just a small householder development or a really small site, then you won't have to show that 10% net gain. There are some exclusions. So sites where we are saying no matter how much net gain you show, you cannot replace that habitat. It is irreplaceable. So habitats like ancient woodland you can't just put through the metric, which I'll talk about in a moment, and come out with a net gain. We're saying that habitat is unreplaceable, and therefore you cannot achieve a net gain if that habitat is to be impacted on a development site. So that's like a really quick overview of lots of different areas of net gain, where there's still huge debates about how it's going to work, the ins and outs of what's going to happen when it becomes mandatory in November. And then how is it measured? I've already mentioned biodiversity units. So net gain is going to be measured using habitats only. So like I said, the species that we work with, protected species, bats, newts, dormice, reptiles, they will still be as protected, but they don't factor into how biodiversity net gain is measured. It's measured by habitats, the habitats present on the site, how they're going to be enhanced, created. It's based on a classification called UK HAB, which is a separate classification that the government have decided to use so that everybody is working with the same classification for the habitats that are present on the site. The drawing there is a map that we've produced based on UK HAB, and then we basically parcel up the land on site into those different habitat polygons according to set habitats. The measure is biodiversity units. So once we've done that biodiversity net gain assessment, it's all about how many units does the site generate? How many units was the baseline? And having proposed enhancement or habitat creation, how many biodiversity units has the site generated potentially post-development? It's measured in areas, in hectares and linears. So areas would be, say, grassland, woodland, scrub. Linear would be hedgerow, ditches, rivers. And those two habitats are treated completely separately in the metric. So you can have a gain in habitat areas. Well, actually what usually happens is you have a gain in linear meters net gain, and most of our clients are at the moment showing a -% in those area habitats. Is the area habitats that are proving difficult to get that 10% net gain on the kind of typical sites that we're working on at the moment. And then this is just a really quick look at the metric. So this is the government's Excel spreadsheet that we're all working to, biodiversity metric 4, where we plug in the habitat baseline, the areas of habitat, the types of habitat. We then plug in what habitat is going to be created, enhanced, whether that's on-site, off-site. And there are lots of different sheets to this metric tool. We plug it all into this and it will tell you if there is a 10% net gain or not. And it will tell you the habitats and the areas that is lacking and that needs looking into a bit more. So the habitats, we're measuring the habitats, we're finding out how many biodiversity units each habitat on the site is worth now and how many units it could be worth with enhancement. And the kind of factors that make a difference to how many biodiversity units a parcel of land is worth would be the size of the site and the size of the different habitats. So the larger the habitat, the more units it's going to generate. The condition that habitat is in. So you could have a large area of grassland, but it could be in poor condition compared to a smaller area of grassland in a higher condition. And that smaller area of grassland potentially could then generate more biodiversity units because it's in a better condition. And habitat condition assessment is something that we undertake for every biodiversity net gain assessment. So we will have a look at those habitat conditions and plug those into the metric. The condition assessment is key, and it's going to make a huge shift to how we work as ecologists. We need botanists, basically, to do this work. A lot of ecological consultants are kind of generalists. And so what we're looking for now in the industry is more botanists, more people with that expert experience on botany and to be able to identify these habitats properly and to be able to condition assess them properly. Then there's distinctiveness. So some habitats are more distinctive than others. This is set within the metric, but For example, a lowland meadow has a high distinctiveness than modified grassland, which would be, say, a playing field, amenity grassland type area. So that habitat distinctiveness comes into play on how many units it can generate. And then there's strategic significance of where that habitat is. Is that habitat located in a strategically significant area? Is it connecting? Is it a habitat corridor connecting parcels of woodland? Is it detailed within the local plan by the local planning authority as in an area of significance? So those four factors there play a big role in how many units a particular parcel of land will generate when it's going through this biodiversity net gain assessment. And then I've talked about the metric, but really important is that biodiversity net gain is not just about a metric. It's not just about plugging in numbers, coming up with an answer, and then tweaking that metric to try and find that 10% key figure for developers. It's about working to these good practice principles, doing the best for biodiversity, working the best habitats for that site, and achieving something more than just the numbers. So really thinking about what habitats go back into the site, what habitats are we creating, why are we creating those habitats, where are we creating those habitats? So it's not just a numbers game. And there are these good practice principles that we work to as ecologists that are published by SAIM and Syria and IEMA that we have to clearly demonstrate in every one of our biodiversity net gain assessments. So it's not just about plugging those numbers in and getting a number out. And then lastly, just to say that this is a huge shift in the planning process for biodiversity, for ecologists, for design teams like landscape ecologists, for our developer clients. As an ecologist, I've been talking to our clients and as much as possible for years about how we need to be brought into projects early. We need to have involvement early to be able to guide the scheme, the design, to avoid impacts to protected species and important habitats. But it's not until now, I think, where biodiversity net gain is going to basically force that upon anyone who is developing land and needing planning approval. Biodiversity net gain needs to be considered really early, and if possible, even at land purchase stage, because there's going to be habitats that just can't be developed because their baseline value is so high that there's just no way that 10% would ever be achievable. So as ecologists, we need to be involved in that really early stage. We need to be involved in the design team, designing those habitats, working with landscape architects, working with architects and our developer clients to work out the best habitats where they should be to maximize those biodiversity units on site. It's going to be an iterative process. We're going to go back and forth, like I said, with the design team, working out the best habitats, maximizing those units. And it's going to be the collaboration that as ecologists, we've been looking for a long time. Being brought into the early stages is where we can really make a difference to a project. And I think B&G is going to force that to happen once it becomes mandatory in November. What next is we do still have a lot of questions unanswered. That was a really quick whirlwind tour of B&G, but there's so much that we could talk about, but there's so much we still don't know yet. So the secondary legislation is going to hopefully answer our questions, but it's not going to be until this is worked through, until November comes, that we know what's happening, how we're going to work together, how successful it's going to be, what successful looks like, and potentially the pitfalls that we're going to come across. And like I said before, the small sites metric is not till November, spring 2024. So this, basically we're waiting for November and we're waiting for that secondary legislation at the moment. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Amy. That was really interesting. Great to know more about the sort of mechanics behind how these things work as well. Great to see the questions coming in the chat. Please do keep them coming in. We'll answer them all at the end once we've heard from both speakers. And on that note, I'd like to introduce our second one, Simon Brooks, who is Strategic Planning Manager at NatureScot. With a background in planning, EIA and protected areas, Simon's current focus is on enabling good development and business to play their part in delivering a nature-rich future. His responsibilities include supporting the Scottish Government's implementation of a new requirement under the Planning Acts for development to secure positive effects for biodiversity, which is Scotland's distinct approach to delivering biodiversity net gain. Okay, great. Simon, over to you when you're ready.
Thanks very much, and I'll hopefully share my screen now. Have you got that?
Yep, we can see it fine. Thanks,
That's
Simon.
great. Okay, well, thanks. And good afternoon, everyone. And thanks to the Natural Capital Initiative for this invitation to speak about Scotland's approach to biodiversity net gain. For those of you who aren't so familiar with Scotland's institutions, I work for NatureScot, which is the Scottish Government's statutory advisor on nature. I'm going to quickly, in this presentation, after a few words on a bit of Scottish context, focus on recent developments with our planning system and the policy approach that has been established to enhance biodiversity, before concluding with some thoughts on the challenges that we're facing in making this a success. Scotland, of course, is no different to the rest of the UK in having to address the twin climate and nature crises. And these 2019 stats for Scotland that will be updated later this month are pretty sobering. The challenge for all of us is not simply to avoid making things worse, but to actually make things better and enhance biodiversity. And just as recently published last week, this is what the Scottish Biodiversity Strategy aims to do, setting out a very challenging ambition to halt the loss of nature by 2030, only 7 years away now, and also restore biodiversity by 2045. One of the means to help achieve this is biodiversity net gain, although Scottish Government has not adopted this terminology. Instead, you'll see references to securing positive effects for biodiversity or just biodiversity enhancement. But in NatureScot, we consider the policy intent to be broadly the same. As in England, this has been applied to the planning system, reflecting that urbanisation and land use change is one of the 9 main pressures on biodiversity identified by the State of Nature report. And this is resulting not just in direct loss, but also wider disturbance of species, fragmentation of habitats, etc. Planning, therefore, has an important role to play in addressing the impacts of development and, importantly, making the most of the opportunities that development can provide. Scottish planning legislation in 2019 introduced a new requirement for Scotland's long-term spatial strategy, the National Planning Framework, to set out how development will contribute to a set of 6 national outcomes. And it's one of these outcomes, phrased as securing positive effects for biodiversity, which in terms of intent is similar to delivering BNG that NPF needs to address. But in contrast to England's statutory approach that Amy's just outlined, it does this through a number of policies set out in NPF 4, the main ones of which are listed here. Of note is the very first policy, which places the climate and nature crises at NPS 4's heart. The government's intention is that the twin crises should be prioritised in all planning decisions, and this is a theme that runs strongly through all of NPF 4. And this policy is particularly important as Scotland's policy approach requires the policies enhancing biodiversity to be considered in the round as part of all the overall planning balance. So this is distinct or in contrast to England's strict legal requirement to deliver biodiversity net gain as a prerequisite to actually getting your consent. In terms of securing positive effects, the key policy is Policy 3 on biodiversity. But before discussing this, I want to just recognise that enhancing biodiversity is not entirely new, as I'm sure many of you realise. So before we got NPF4, the planning system was already tasked with enhancing biodiversity, although it was more optional and not necessarily delivering a net gain. The former Scottish planning policy, now replaced by NPF4, was encouraging of benefits for biodiversity to be sought, albeit it was worded as a nice to have rather than an absolute requirement. Many local plans have already included policies seeking biodiversity enhancements as well, such as these Fife and Aberdeen City examples. And planning authorities then as now had a duty to further the conservation of biodiversity under the 2004 Nature Conservation Scotland Act. So what does NPF4 Policy 3 say that is different? Not surprisingly, for a plan-led system, it prompts the local development plan to enhance biodiversity. Some planning authorities have already adopted policy and guidance setting out specific requirements, such as how the enhancements should be measured to demonstrate what is being delivered, or providing a particular level of uplift, such as you have in England, in terms of the biodiversity expected. Policy 3A establishes a requirement for all development to contribute to enhance biodiversity. This is a step change in approach from one that previously accepted the impact of development, albeit minimised, as recognised here in Policy 3D, to one where development is now required to provide something additional. And this could be to the extent that a net gain is delivered, but not necessarily so. Policy 3B is a much clearer net gain policy. This sets out more stringent requirements for the most significant developments, those that are categorised as national or major development, and those subject to environmental impact assessment. This requires significant biodiversity enhancements to be provided and for biodiversity to be left in a demonstrably better state than without intervention. That is before the development goes ahead. Now in Scotland, this policy has prompted questions from both planners and developers about how much enhancement needs to be provided and how this should be demonstrated. As in contrast to England, there's no requirement for a 10% uplift, nor a prescribed metric to calculate this. Turning to Policy 3C now, this applies to the category of local development, smaller scale, although they can still be quite sizable. For example, up to a 2-hectare site and 49 dwellings. This policy requires what are called appropriate measures to conserve, restore and enhance biodiversity that should be required proportionate to the development's nature and scale, to be included in the application. Similar to the requirements of Policy 3A, these measures could be on a scale that delivers net gain, but not necessarily so. And I think it's unlikely that they would be delivering net gain. Finally, Policy 3D requires impacts to be minimised, as you would expect. But this now requires to be considered within the context of the need to reverse loss and build resilience. But returning to Policy 3C, although this applies to the smaller scale of development, these are by far the majority of Scottish planning applications, most of which will be prepared without ecological expertise. Guidance on what are considered to be appropriate measures has therefore been set out in NatureScot's Developing with Nature guidance. This has been written with applicants and planning officers in mind to be understandable by both a lay reader and professionals. The bulk of the guidance details 24 measures set out here for enhancing nature, grouped in 3 categories. Now, this isn't an exhaustive list of all potential actions that could be undertaken to fulfil this policy, but those that are considered relevant to local developments, relatively straightforward to include, and widely applicable across much of Scotland. Opportunities for enhancing biodiversity, not just the garden and green space elements of any development, but also the buildings and structures to be built, the borders and boundaries dividing the site, and of course the management of rain and surface water. For each of the measures, the guidance does describe what it is and the benefits it brings for nature, but importantly, the key requirements and future needs, that are needed to make it a success, and also links to further information. The guidance isn't seeking to duplicate detailed design and management advice, which is well presented elsewhere. Whether these measures individually will deliver a net gain in practice is perhaps unlikely. But if all local developments deliver some of these measures, cumulatively, they should add up to enhancing biodiversity to a degree, and hopefully also change attitudes and behaviours more widely in support of nature. So that's the policy approach that the Scottish Government has taken. And so I want to offer you some thoughts on the challenges in Scotland that we probably need to think about if we are to be confident that development is actually delivering biodiversity enhancement, if not net gain. The first I've alluded to already is the need for clarity and discussion, and when I discuss policy 3B on the most significant developments. The absence of a common approach to measuring and demonstrating that biodiversity has been enhanced is resulting in Scotland in both developers and planning authorities having to establish their own approaches, resulting in duplication and inefficiencies and inconsistency, if not confusion. The Scottish Government do appear alive to this issue and are preparing guidance on Policy 3 that should provide some clarity on these aspects, and we're expecting that sort of later on this autumn. Scottish Government has also commissioned SRUC, that's Scotland's Rural College, to undertake a review of biodiversity metrics and considered what would be appropriate or what potentially could be appropriate to Scotland's needs across a range of policy areas. And that's including enabling investment in natural capital, what's required for land management support, as well as the planning system. We are awaiting their decision in light of this report on what the next steps are going to be with those conclusions. The second challenge is whether we have the right and up-to-date framework in place to inform decisions on the most appropriate biodiversity enhancements. And this is because selecting the right enhancements need to take a place-based approach informed by relevant plans and strategies. This includes, in particular, any local biodiversity action plan, but also green network, open space, or forest and woodland strategies that might have been prepared, potentially habitat connectivity mapping that might have been undertaken, and local biological or environmental record centre information. But we're well aware that the coverage of these various strategies and data that's available is uneven across Scotland, as is their age. We also need to bear in mind that some of these strategies have not been written with these new planning requirements in mind. So the question is how fit for purpose these are in terms of guiding and informing decisions about what is the most appropriate enhancements to be required. Thirdly, and this is quite a hot topic in Scotland, how can we best build the capacity required that enables good development alongside nature? There's no simple answer when resources around the planning system and local authorities are very constrained. But we think tackling this is required if biodiversity enhancement or net gain is to be an essential rather than a nice to have element of development. The industry has an important role to play, we think, in this part. So individual developers, but bodies such as the construction sector's supply chain sustainability school, as well as other bodies, in raising the game. We need to be better at sharing and learning from each other as we go forward and gain experience with the new policy. Fourth, and this is quite a basic challenge, is about implementation. How to ensure what is planned for and consented is delivered well. Our experience is that implementation does require improvement, and we're aware that these concerns are recognised not just by planners but also by developers. We need to do better to ensure existing biodiversity on site is protected in practice, that what is promised in the application is actually delivered, and that it is done well. This is not just about planning enforcement, but improving understanding of what is good practice and raising expectations of what is required. With these new policy requirements coming into play, there's a lot of focus on what these mean in practice, but we also need to look at what we really should be doing already in terms of, through the planning system, in terms of delivering for biodiversity. And the final challenge is how to ensure that all the effort at the planning stage results in a lasting legacy. Reversing biodiversity loss isn't just for this year or even the next 5, but needs to be permanent. It's already been mentioned that England has developed an approach that requires biodiversity gains to be locked in for at least 30 years. We don't have something like that in Scotland. So what should Scotland's timescale be? And do we have the right mechanisms to achieve this, and an approach that provides confidence in the outcomes to be delivered, yet allows flexibility to respond to the impact of climate change, diseases that we know are affecting nature, and other unknowns such as future new development? We need a flexible approach. So to conclude, the nature crisis does present us with a pretty big challenge, but development does have an important contribution to make towards addressing this. We know what needs to be done, and NPF4 certainly provides strong support to push for this. You'll see, comparing what Amy's outlined and what I've outlined, that Scotland has taken a less prescriptive and a more policy-based approach to delivering enhancement, which is a more loosely defined ambition than biodiversity net gain. In contrast to England's approach, it does not precisely prescribe how much enhancement is required. We don't have a set 10% uplift target. Neither how this is to be evidenced. We don't have a defined metric, and we certainly don't have a minimum period over which this should be secured, just reference to a long term. And so we don't have new planning tools or mechanisms that have been introduced in support of delivery. Instead, we've got a more flexible approach, but this does require a large amount of judgment in its application. Which of these, I think, contrasting approach delivers more for biodiversity, it remains to be seen. So watch this space in the next few years. So up on the screen there, I've put a link to our Developing with Nature guidance that I mentioned, and also my contact details if anyone wants to come back with any further queries beyond this webinar. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Simon. That was brilliant. Interesting to note the sort of quite significant divisions between both English and Scottish policy on quite a similar issue there. Great to see so many questions coming in the chat. So I think we should just dive straight in. Yeah, if I could invite Amy and Simon to bring their cameras back on. Let's just see what we've got here first. Okay, so question for both of you, I suppose. How can spatial planning for biodiversity be prioritised as off-site recipients rather than rely on an otherwise uncoordinated supply of ad hoc banked habitat? So I suppose that's asking, how do we ensure that areas who have planned for an area to be protected as an area of high biodiversity, how do we ensure they get the government credits or are prioritised for those sort of things? Amy, perhaps we start with your thoughts and then we hear from Simon afterwards.
Yeah, so this is something that the metric does deal with. One of the sections in the metric is what strategic significance is that parcel of land that you're proposing to enhance or create. And you basically achieve more biodiversity units if you can say it's of strategic significance, rather than if something that wasn't. So if you're looking to create units, you would want to create strategically significant habitats. And what counts as strategically significant is if you can link it up to the local authorities' plans for biodiversity. So there are local nature recovery strategies. In Kent, we've got the Kent and Medway local nature recovery strategy, and there are 48, I think, now in England, and they are furiously working away right now on coming up with what is important for those local areas. So in Kent and Medway, they're coming up with what's important for Kent and Medway, and they have lots of different stakeholders, different industries involved to come up with what is strategically important. And like I said, if you plug into the metric, yes, it's strategically insignificant, then you're going to gain more units more easily. So that's how it's encouraged sort of through the metric stage of net gain.
Okay, right. Yes, good to see that there is a sort of pathway connecting the credits sort of production and then its use. Simon, do you have any thoughts you want to come in on that with?
Yes, obviously we don't have something like the metric, which obviously builds in that strategic significance as an issue. Similar to England's approach, and Amy did mention this, you know, the sort of default is on site to start with, and Scotland as a policy approach has also adopted that. But because we've got a more flexible approach and leaves things to judgment, it does allow decisions to be made in a way that if you want to go off site because you think you are going to achieve greater gain, then you can do that. And our developing with nature guidance actually does recognize that as one of the considerations that should be taken into account by the decision maker. And it is already happening in some places already. Scottish Borders Council, who, you know, over a number of years have been looking at how this is before even NPF4, were looking at how they could make the most of development that was going in, were able to take monies from particularly wind farm developers, but put it towards more strategic projects and deliver on the ground in that way. So rather than just looking at, you know, smaller ad hoc type interventions, you know, they took a more proactive view and tried to steer, you know, those benefits to certain places.
Great, thanks. All right, next question we've got is, I suppose this is a question for you, Amy, and the BNG sort of calculation tool. How do we measure the distinctiveness of a habitat? I mean, it's sort of a separate point to its biodiversity, I suppose.
The short answer is that we don't. The metric sets that. So you choose the habitat type in the metric and it comes with a set distinctiveness. So as the ecologist working with that, we don't measure distinctiveness, is the short, blunt answer.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks. Just to see, there's a follow-up question sort of linked to that. I mean, someone's commented, I'm told the general rule in ecological surveys is the longer you spend measuring, the more you find. Do you accept that point? And sort of how does it affect an objective measure of biodiversity? I mean, that would be interesting from your point of view, like if you're surveying a site, are there sort of time constraints or sort of legal time constraints you're allowed to survey a particular area or something?
So generally speaking, I mean, I would say no, but yes. So if we move away from biodiversity net gain slightly, we sometimes involve expert botanists or expert entomologists, and we'll get a report back that says there is a fly on the site that hasn't been recorded since 1981 and that it's extremely rare. But it turns out no one's been looking for that fly since 1981. So potentially the right kind of people are looking for those species, and that's why they're found. Generally speaking, that doesn't happen with protected species. We have, the set protected species, and if you're looking for them in the right way, you will find them or not. In terms of net gain, like I was saying, we're going to have a real heavy reliance on botanists, and botanists are lacking in our industry. So until now, you can be an ecological consultant with a good general knowledge of botany. Obviously, the better your botanical knowledge, the better ecologist you will be. But we, until now, have got experts in. I'm specifically talking about native ecology here. When we know we need an expert botanist, we'll get them in. But now every single one of our projects is going to have botany included within it. And I think you'll find a lot of people in the industry will send out ecologists who aren't experienced enough in botany to go and do those surveys. And those ecologists are either going to not find something or be over precautionary because they know they don't have the experience and think they found something they haven't. So that goes for the habitat condition assessments. The local planning authorities are going to have to really look at who is doing that condition assessment, what their experience is with botany, so that they know that they are categorizing and finding the right species to indicate that habitat. So I wouldn't say it's the longer you look, I would say it's who's looking. That is the answer to that. And it'll be up to the LPAs to kind of police that. Obviously, as ecologists, you need to put those credentials in the report. This is the person who did it and this is their experience. Yeah. And then the LPAs will kind of police that when they get those reports through.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to touch on that. There, it seems like there is sort of a big skills gap that's going to be needed to fulfill this sort of, well, potentially huge sort of demand there might be for all these surveys once it comes into force. Let's move on to another question now. We had a couple of points about the sort of 30-year protection for sites on this scheme. I mean, how do we ensure that they're protected? Whether, I suppose it's enshrined in policy, but I mean, both in that 30 years and beyond, like how do we sort of ensure that these sites are sort of ring fence for that period of time? Again, maybe if we start with you and me and then take a point from Simon.
This is something that's under kind of huge debate at the moment for biodiversity net gain. The secondary legislation is going to add more detail to exactly how it's going to be protected. At the moment, it said that the use of Section 106 agreements and conservation covenants are legal agreements between landowners, the developer and the LPA to secure that land for 30 years. There's been lots of discussion about who's going to police it. And then lots of people are looking towards the LPA and saying, you're the people to police this, to see if it has or hasn't been secured for 30 years. But the LPA are saying we don't have the resources to police every single piece of BNG land for 30 years. So that's something that's still up in the air. What has been said is this National Sites Register, where you register each area of BNG land, is going to be open to the public. And they're saying that because it's open to the public scrutiny, anyone can go and have a look on there. Anyone can check up on their neighbours, the developers, to see if they actually are doing what they said they would for BNG. So basically policed by the public. But we are going to be looking straight at the secondary legislation for kind of black and white details on how that's going to be secured.
Great. Simon, do you have anything to add on that point?
Yeah, I mean, although we don't have that 30-year limit, I mean, it still is a discussion of relevance in Scotland. Similar to England, people are looking at our Section 75s, which are equivalent to Section 106s, I think, in England as one means to do that. We are also expecting that this guidance that Scottish Government are in the process of producing will be saying something about this. What their expectation is. I don't think they will prescribe a plan authorities, thou shalt do this in order to secure it. But I think they're going to give a steer about what the mechanisms are that should be used.
On that note about the Scottish Government, we had a couple of questions about someone from Alistair here. When do we expect the Scottish Royal College review for Scottish Government of approaches for establishing a Scottish biodiversity metric to be shared? And then sort of a follow-up onto that, another question of, do you think the goals that Scotland have set, I know that may not be set in stone. Do you think Scotland is on track with its ambition so far?
Well, the first one's the easier one to answer. I think it's pretty imminent in terms of getting the publication of the SRUC report and also a view from government about what they think the next steps are. We've been waiting for this for a while now, but I think they're just trying to make sure they're joined up internally and are sure about what they want to do next. In terms of are we on track? No, I don't think any country is actually on track with the crisis that we're facing. I think I would turn the question around and say, are we clear about what contribution this can make to help getting us on track, in terms of whether it's England's BNG approach or Scotland's more policy approach. Are we clear about what that contribution will be to helping to address the crises, given that we haven't got a specific target about how much this will contribute at the end of the day. We're certainly still in that quite an area of vague policy aspiration, and at this stage without a formal monitoring mechanism either, as to how successful it has been. When we look back over in a year or two's time, how successful has it been on delivering?
We've got so many questions in the chat. I was just trying to rattle through a few more before we finish up. Question here that said, I was interested in Amy's comment that some types of habitats may become practically undevelopable. Presumably some are already undevelopable if they contain protected species and habitats, ancient woodlands, or etc. What other types of places and habitats fall into this category of I suppose, heavily protected areas? And I suppose as a follow-up to that, is there any sort of joined up conversations between England, Scotland, Wales over where these habitats are and sort of how they're being prioritized for things that may migrate between the two? So I guess, Amy, if we start with you on that point.
So the first question about undevelopable land, we have worked on a number of planning applications where there are, say, ancient woodland irreplaceable habitats on the site, and certainly they are much more likely to be turned down for any development. Generally speaking, they would require like a 15-meter buffer zone of impacts from an irreplaceable habitat like ancient woodland. In extreme circumstances, those habitats can be impacted by development. So there's a clause in the planning policy that says, basically, if the purpose of the development outweighs the value of that habitat, then the LPA can decide to grant planning permission for impacts to an ancient woodland, for example. Then below ancient woodland, you have woodland that's high value, but not obviously irreplaceable. And we do see developments that impact that kind of habitat relatively often. The LPA will usually come back and want compensation, or at least to show there's been mitigation to impact it as least as possible. But those habitats we are seeing, impacted by development projects all the time. Protected species wise, they never, very rarely, unless they're in protected areas like SSSIs or SPAs, like sites of special scientific interest. So unless they're in those protected sites or associated with those protected sites, a protected species will rarely, if ever, stop a development. There'll be mitigation and ways around compensation measures for a protected species. In terms of biodiversity net gain, I think it will be financial reasons then why developers don't develop that land. It will be not that it's undevelopable because the habitat is so good, it's that the habitat that becomes so valuable that it's not financially worthwhile to develop that land, that you need so many biodiversity units to compensate building, say, 20 houses, that it outweighs ever building on that land in the first place. So I think it's hitting developers in the pocket is going to stop those habitats being impacted by development.
Simon, just to bring you, do you have any comment on that as well?
Not on the point that Amy's addressed. I mean, I think there was more question about the coordination. And I mean, where the coordination has tended to focus is on the protected areas and through the work of the Joint Nature Conservation Committee. So across the countries, there is that. But taking within a Scottish perspective, I think what this policy is doing is moving away from that focus, and some would argue undue focus just on protected areas that we've had up to now with our conservation work. And looking at what needs to be done with some of these more common habitats, and that is, we are trying to take a more coordinated approach through, and I think probably similar to England, through the development of nature networks that is in linking together some of our most valued sites will actually pick up some areas that are not so valued at the moment, but if you like, recognise their potential and their role in providing that connectivity that is supporting nature.
Great. I think we've probably just got time for one more very quick question. We've had a couple of points about the cost of a biodiversity net gain unit. I mean, will the cost of a unit sort of factor into a habitat's maintenance over the 30-year period? And is that cost sort of is the cost of a unit going to fund the maintenance of that habitat? And what is the sort of cost for one biodiversity unit? Does it fluctuate, or is it a fixed unit price? Perhaps, yeah. Simon, if we start with you on that, or
well, we don't know yet. Obviously, DEFRA has published its sort of costs for the statutory, the last resort option. And they've done that so as not to skew the market. So we're expecting the market to come in below those costs. We're yet to see how much below they will do. It's something we're keeping tabs on. I can't give you chapter and verse on this. We are looking at it, not least because of the wider issue beyond our planning policy about getting private investment into natural capital. The sort of 12 to 20 billion shortfall in funds that are required in Scotland alone to meet our biodiversity ambitions. On the point about, well, do they factor in management costs? Yes, they certainly will need to factor in. England has the advantage, they need to think about 30 years. The question in Scotland, I guess, until we decide what that period is going to be quite difficult to factor that in as a cost.
Amy, do you have any points you'd like to add on that?
Yeah, agree with all of those points. And just to add on that the more distinctive the habitat is and the harder it is to manage, yes, it will be more expensive. Again, that is like if you're talking about a carrot and a stick, it's a stick to stop developers then developing those more valuable sites, because it'll be more expensive to buy units to replace that habitat. We are doing lots of work for landowners at the moment, biodiversity net gain assessing their land, because they're looking to provide units for developers, and we're basing those units on between £20,000 and £35,000 on average per unit, and that's thinking about grassland, scrub units mainly. Woodland units will be habitat like woodland units will be more expensive. So at the moment, £20,000 to £30,000 is the average we're working with, but we don't know. Like Simon said, the government have recently come out with what they're setting theirs at, in the I hope that everyone else will be below that, but it's an open market at the moment.
Great, that's really interesting. I think that leaves us out of time, so thanks for everyone's questions. I wish we could have another hour, really. It's just incredibly interesting listening to both your perspectives on this. So yeah, thank you all for attending. I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks to our speakers again for those two really interesting talks and for fielding such a wide range of questions, and to the events team here for organising this event. Just a reminder, a survey will be shared in the chat, and we're asked for your experience, and we'd be grateful for any feedback you have on the event, and any sort of suggestions you might have. Just to let you know, we are also planning another event in the NCI calendar for this year, and that will be shared on our 3 organisational platforms once we have the final details. So yeah, thanks again to both of you, Amy and Simon, for attending and for such really interesting talks. And thank you all for coming along. And hope you have a great afternoon.